Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I am Erin Kelly, Associate Director of Preservation Massachusetts, welcoming you to Day 2 of the 2021 Mass Historic Preservation Conference. We hope that yesterday's presentations were informative, insightful, and perhaps pushed you to consider different views or approaches. Today, we have another great lineup of sessions and panelists, beginning with today's keynote presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce Lawana Holland-Moore, Program Officer with the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, the National Trust's multi-year $25 million initiative to identify, elevate, and support the voices, stories, and places of African American activism, achievement, and community. Luana was a 2014 National Trust Kolodny Scholar and wrote her master's thesis on ethnic minority heritage values and the U.S. Historic Preservation Significance Policy. She was a researcher for the White House Historical Association, where she served on the National Trust's Diversity and Inclusion Group representing Decatur House. A D.C. native, Luana also serves on the Landmarks Committee of the D.C. Preservation League. You can read more about Luana and her work in her biography on the conference website. It is now both an honor and a pleasure to welcome Miss Lawana Holland-Moore to present We Are Here, Preservation as an Act of Reclamation.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Erin. And let's go ahead and bring this up. Okay, hello everyone. I am Lawana Holland-Moore, Program Officer of the National Trust African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. I give this keynote to you during a time of uncertainty, but also at a time when our past experiences with resilience and perseverance have become more important than ever. I'd like to also remind you that if you have any questions for me to please use the Q&A function and I will try to answer them afterwards. First, I would like to recognize Marita Rivero, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., and Dr. Evelyn Higginbotham for their service as Action Fund Advisory Council members. I would also like to thank the Boston-based Bar and Clareman Foundations for investing in the Action Fund. And of course, I would like to recognize our partners such as the Boston Preservation Alliance and Historic Boston, as well as Preservation Massachusetts, for their leadership and advocacy and diversity. The African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund is the National Trust for Historic Preservation's multi-year $50 million initiative committed to crafting a narrative that expands our view of history by telling the full story of African American historic sites and to promote a national identity that reflects the nation's true diversity. The Action Fund is the largest preservation effort ever undertaken in support of African American historic sites. I show you this slide to remind you of the climate that inspired the Action Fund's creation. Massacre of African American congregants at Mother Emanuel in Charleston, South Carolina, by a white supremacist in 2015. The vandalization of the African Meeting House in Nantucket in 2018. The African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund was created in 2017 in response to the events in the center image, Unite to Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. These are hard images to see. But in the face of such hate, the world needed to know our stories more than ever. We cannot shy away from telling stories that reflect and expose our complex past. We can draw from them and use them to create and shape a better future. This December, the Action Fund will enter year 5 of our national grant program. We have hit and surpassed our original goal of $25 million. And thanks to a $20 million gift from philanthropist Mackenzie Scott and her husband, Dan Jewett, we are now a $50 million fund. We hope to continue to draw attention to the remarkable and still largely unrecognized and unheard collection of places and stories of African American activism and achievement. To be able to talk about the work of the Action Fund and its purpose is to ask a question that is often asked of me. Why is the preservation of African American historic sites and places important? When we speak of place, we speak of memory, of tangible connections. We can walk where they walked, touch where they touch, be where they were. Place allows us to inhabit a moment in time, connecting us to those through lines that link us to the past. But what happens when those moments in time have been obscured or omitted outright? What happens when those stories have not been heard? There's a gap, a hole that becomes our responsibility to discover and peel back those layers within a site to give us a more complete picture of place. Pictured here is Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, Virginia. Once one of the largest slave trading markets in the United States, second only to New Orleans. This sacred space along the James River was paved over a parking lot, its history overlooked and forgotten by so many. Through intervention and our support, this sacred space is not in danger anymore of becoming a stadium or anything else, but a place to remember and reflect as a memorial park and site. Since January 2018, we have vetted over 2,000 project proposals requesting over $190 million and have awarded over $7.3 million to 150 awardees and projects nationwide. Through our national grant program and involvement in initiatives such as our Historically Black Colleges and Universities Cultural Stewardship Initiative in partnership with the National Endowment for the Humanities, we have been able to see and bring awareness to the breadth of African American preservation need. It gives us a picture of what is being done nationwide. What are those needs? What are people working on? What are they concerned about? What is going on? America has been rich in history, but often poor in representing it and funding its protection, conservation, and recognition. Part of reclaiming history is the empowerment that comes with being able to actively support sites, organizations, and outward-facing projects that are working to make it happen. From our preservation leadership trainings for organizations to our fellows who are thinking about how to talk about preservation in new and innovative and creative ways. Funding the 2019 Preserving African American Places Equity Report that examined gentrification and displacement in historically Black neighborhoods across the country. And working with Hope Crew, the National Trust hands-on preservation experience program that helps to encourage and inspire a new generation to train in the preservation trades. We can also provide technical assistance for any site or the public to find out about what they can do to preserve their historic site. That's actually one of my favorite parts of this job, is interacting with the public and helping them find out more about what they can do to preserve the sites and these places that are of meaning to them. It is not enough to say that you want to make a difference. You must actually do it. One thing that I want you to take away is that African Americans are out there doing preservation work, from maintaining family and church cemeteries to contributing to building funds, fighting for recognition of historic rural schools for Black children, or Green Book sites that hosted performers and Black travelers during Jim Crow when they had nowhere else to stay. African Americans are doing preservation work, even when they are not necessarily calling themselves preservationists. That is why it is so special and so important and so necessary to do this work and to be able to acknowledge those efforts. Many of those efforts are happening right in the state of Massachusetts. Action Fund awardees in Massachusetts have included the following organizations and sites. A 2019 awardee, the Museum of African American History in Boston, which also maintains African meeting houses in both Boston and Nantucket, as well as Nantucket's Boston Higginbotham House, some of the oldest African American landmarks in America. The museum received funding for programming and interpretation in order to continue to tell the stories of New Englanders of African descent. Pictured here is a view from the balcony of the 1806 Meeting House on Beacon Street in Boston. The Martha's Vineyard African American Heritage Trail is a 2021 awardee whose funding will allow them to hire a director of research and outreach to help them to tell the story of this historic African American residential and resort community. Pictured are two former boarding houses, one in definite need of restoration. The historic photo is of guests, staff, and the owners of the 1915 Shearer Inn and Laundry. A 2020 Action Fund awardee, the National Center of Afro-American Artists at Abbotsford and Roxbury is dedicated to the exhibition of Black visual arts. Since 1976, it has been located within the 1872 High Victorian Gothic Abbotsford Mansion, the sole survivor of estate houses lost during urban renewal in Roxbury during the 1960s and 70s. You can see one of the highlights of its collection on the grounds, artist John Wilson's 1987 monumental sculpture, Eternal Presence. Our award helped to provide funding for a much needed roof replacement project. Located 3 blocks from notable African-American scholar, activist, and writer W.E.B. Du Bois's childhood home, Clinton AME Zion Church in Great Barrington was his introduction to the Black church. A 2019 awardee, restoration will enable the church to continue to be a pillar of its community and interpret the life of W.E.B. Du Bois. I think that the marker in front of the church in the right image just says it all. Preservation works. Among our first group of awardees in 2018, the Action Fund provided funding to enable the Roxbury Cultural District to hire its first paid staff member and increase the organization's capacity to preserve, interpret, and present the story of this African-American community's rich history. Pictured are landmarks within the community, such as the 1750 Dillaway Thomas House that served as a Continental Army headquarters during the Siege of Boston, and to the right, the Dudley Square bus station. And you can see in the corner, historic image of Dudley Square. We will go from one of our first awardees to another one of our newest, the League of Women for Community Service in Boston, received $165,000 in July 2021, making them our highest grant awardee to date. We actually just secured additional funding to help them complete their portico restoration, pictured in the upper right. Headquartered in an 1857 brownstone, formerly owned by the abolitionist Carnes family, it is a documented underground railroad stop. During World War I, the League provided relief to African-American soldiers. And later, when African-American young women could not stay in the segregated dorms at their Boston universities, the League offered rooms for rent to them. This included a young Boston Conservatory student named Coretta Scott, who was courted there by her future husband, Martin Luther King Jr., who lived down the street. To share these stories and preserve these places for the future allows generations to come to be inspired and to know these stories as well. Some of these stories are uplifting. Some of these stories are pain-filled and uncomfortable, but they should be told just the same. The very presence of these sites with their stories as intact as their structures announces to the world, we were present, we were here, we are here still. This act of recognition, this act of preserving of history becomes a vehicle for social change, a vehicle of empowerment. It is an act of reclamation. Through telling our stories, we reclaim them and ourselves as well. We reclaim the names of those who were unknown and give them voice. We reclaim the misperceptions, the stereotypes of who we were as a people and who we are today. We reclaim the ability to state a future that we will be a part of by drawing from the wisdom of the past. African American history is American history. And by elevating these stories and places, we look to not only understand our past, but to also create opportunities for dialogue and to form stronger arguments for how to link preservation to honoring of our ancestors and the honoring of ourselves. Part of that reclamation is through creating new forms of partnerships, retooling interpretation, and rethinking how we conduct outreach. With each new story and new layer comes the real work of telling them and implementing the ways they can be heard. We keep these places alive through collaboration with and the dedication and perseverance of grassroots advocates, preservationists, scholars, politicians, and the community itself to uncover and make visible these stories that contribute to our collective historical narrative as a nation. I leave you with a question to mull over, think about, and consider as you go forward in your work. What story needs to be heard today? If you would like to know more about the work of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund and how you too can help to tell the full story, please visit our website at savingplaces.org. Thank you.
Lawana, thank you so very, very much for that very insightful and powerful presentation. The work of the Action Fund over I can't believe it's already been 5 years. I remember when it was announced at a trust conference in Chicago. But the work obviously you've done a tremendous amount in just 5 years, and we hope so much more to do over the next over the coming decades. And I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I think combined with the presentation we heard yesterday, there's an awful lot of I think there's a lot of opportunity for our attendees to think and hopefully grow as preservationists. And one question I kind of wanted to just, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section, but something that was posed to our keynote presenter yesterday, and I was kind of really curious to hear your take on it. You talked a lot about histories that have been obscured and that haven't been told, and talking about at the very end, you were talking about how we, re-examine or retool interpretation and how we look at histories. And, as a program officer and working directly with so many sites and grassroots organizations, how would you, do you have any thoughts or insight on how to bridge that gap for some people who may not feel the sites that you're looking at, something like Shockoe Bottom, like you said, could have been a parking lot, could have been a stadium, something else. Some people who don't feel that that history is worth telling or doesn't rise to a certain level. How do you kind of bridge that gap with, kind of interested on how you would approach that? And how do we elevate everybody and make, like, as you said, these are African-American history is American history. It's not siloed, but how do we begin to come to terms with that? I know it's a very loaded question, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Well, one of the things is this othering of history, that as I said, that somehow if it's African-American history, that is not necessarily viewed as, is it American history? Of course it is. It's contributing to it. It is a part of it. And for those who are saying, well, I don't know, I don't think that's important, or even do I have to? Or we don't have the capacity to look into that. And I'm like, why not? The history is there. It is a part of your site. And by not doing so, you're not telling the full story of your place, of your site. And what happens is that you'll often find too that we are, especially as practitioners, used to doing things a certain way. We check our boxes, we look for our criteria, and that's that. I have a colleague who was surveying a neighborhood in St. Louis, and they managed to miss a storefront church that was really important to the community. And me being me, I asked them, how did that happen? How did you miss it? I'm just curious. And their answer was, I realized that I was just doing things as we had always done it. We had always done it this way. I didn't really think to look for it. And that's the thing, is that you have to look for those stories. And it's as we become a more people-centered practice and field, because to me, it's a great thing, because that's when those stories come out. That's, and it provides this richer, fuller, just everything to preservation. Our structures do not exist in vacuums. They are a part of a community. They are a part of something. And our stories that come from those sites, that come from those places, are often, born by those community knowledge holders who have so much to be able to share. So when people are like, oh, I'm not sure how to go about this, a lot of times just talking to the community itself will just yield such a rich, deep well to draw from.
I love what you just said, and becoming a more people-centric community, because we're all, we as preservationists, we work to save, like to work and preserve the history of places and sites and buildings, but they're really nothing without people using them now, or the people that made them what they are. So I think that's my little excuse me, my little takeaway from today. I love that. That was wonderful. And also I'm also interested in kind of making a point. You said that, a lot of the, African-American communities are doing preservation, but they wouldn't call themselves preservationists. And I think this is almost a trend we've seen over the past few years, where you have people that are doing preservation work, but they're not, labeling themselves as preservation, whether it's to not fall into, a preconceived, notion, this is what I am, this is what I do. So I wonder if that's maybe, do you think that might be the start of, like the next chapter of preservation, people, coming at it a little bit differently without just checking all the boxes and criteria, as you said, and doing it the way we've always done? Do you have any thoughts or, hope for where we can kind of go from here?
Well, one thing about the whole thing of I don't call myself a preservationist is that we as a field have not always done the best job in terms of being cheerleaders for ourselves and what we do. And for communities of color in particular, we are often at odds. We can sometimes come in and be seen as the antagonist almost, particularly at points of crisis, when something is about to be lost and there is this disconnect between us and the community. That also goes back to a feeling of, who are you, outsiders, to come and tell us? Who are you to talk at us, but not with us? And that also contributes to this feeling of, I don't necessarily want to call myself a preservationist because I don't necessarily want to be associated with that. Also, when you take into account too, that for many marginalized communities, historic preservation is also associated with gentrification and displacement. So there are all these kind of factors kind of working at odds with one another to kind of create this, but it's not insurmountable. And it is a matter of how we approach communities. It's a matter of how we talk, how we include in the decision making and process. All of those things can help to change what we do and help us do it differently. I was once talking to a colleague out in Iowa who was putting together, he wanted to do an African American heritage trail. And he told me, I'm not a preservation dude. And I said, wait a minute. You're putting together a heritage trail. You're looking at all these sites. I think you're a preservation dude. But it just goes to show you, that, as I said, people are doing this work, but they're not necessarily seeing themselves or calling themselves preservationists.
Preservation dude, I can see that on a t-shirt. So if, I know that the National Trust website has tremendous amount of resources for people who may be, for our attendees and, going forward, anybody who would look at, watch this and, be, inspired or to, think a little more critically. Are there resources on the Action Fund's website that could, or, support services, just to begin? Like, sometimes we kind of feel like, well, where do we even start? The problems, it seems very insurmountable, like you said, but, where do we begin? Are there resources on the trust, on the action, the fund's action site that could be used?
Yes, actually, you can visit our website, and the National Trust site actually does really have a lot of great resources and toolkits, just telling you, even if it's from a 101 perspective of, this is how you do this is who you talk to. I do a whole lot of technical assistance. I think in 1 year I did almost 100 inquiries just about Black historic sites alone. And what happens is that you find that because of that disconnect and how we don't really make it clear that we are a resource that is available, a lot of people don't even know that it exists. I find myself explaining to a lot of people about the existence of SHPOs, that every state and DC and US territory has one. And I'm always telling people, no, really, this is a real thing. And this is someone you can talk to in terms of finding out more about what you can do. And a lot of people just don't know where to start. I get so many questions such as, how do I get a marker? How do I go about just getting my historic site recognized in any kind of way, even if it's just being on my town's local landmarks list? So, you find that that's something we need to be better about, is that outreach to the public to let them know that these resources exist in the first place.
Exactly. I find myself having to, explain who we are and what we do, so often. I think that's almost symptomatic of the of the field. But I think you're right. We need to do more outreach. We have a couple of questions. Someone said they'd like to know more about the status and future plans of the Hope Crew program. It seems like a great way to introduce more African American young people to preservation and people in general. So, any updates on the Hope Crew program?
Yes. Our Hope Crew program is ongoing, and I love talking about them. They are always working on the most interesting projects, and I just love the idea of introducing a younger generation to the preservation trades like that. They really will go out and to a historic site and replace windows, do exterior painting, and this is all under the guidance of experienced trade persons. And Hope Crew doesn't just have the youth core component of it, but they also have ones where veterans are involved, as well as community days where the entire community can participate in a Hope Crew project. I know even I've done it here in DC at Congressional Cemetery. I was out there, scrubbing tombstones, and it was just a really fantastic way. And I think it's a great way to not only introduce young persons to preservation trades, but during those community days, introducing them to that experience of going out and hands-on actually doing that preservation work as well. If you're interested in Hope Crew, definitely you can contact the trust as well. They always have something going on. They recently had a project in Oregon where it was like the first all women led team. So Hope Crew is one of my favorite programs to talk about, and we work with them a lot.
Wonderful. That's awesome. There's nothing like hands-on, I feel like when I actually get to do some preservation work, you're always, kind of almost reinvigorates and re-inspires you. This is why we do what we do. We have 2 more questions, if you don't mind. Someone, thank you for sharing why this is important to tell the stories and asking what stories need to be told. Is there a role for government? And I'm not sure if that means like, local, do you feel there's a role for government at any sort of level in this process?
Of course, is the best way I could put that. When we're talking about government, whether we're talking about local, county, state, federal, government are the ones who create the policies. They're the ones who create the policies. They're the ones who can provide funding. They are the ones who can make things happen. And that's why it's so important, if we're talking about government and talking about the community and that disconnect too, that government plays that part because they do the things that affect everything else. They end up being the standard bearers, but also the community can help the government in terms of making them aware, like, look, these are the things that are important to us. These are the sites that are important to us. These are the things that we need for our community in terms of, if we're speaking of preservation, in terms of the site. If you're talking about issues such as gentrification and displacement, government, this is what we need as a community to help us deal with this. So yes, absolutely, government has a place in terms of preservation and helping with these efforts.
And one more question. I know you kind of did touch on this, but the preservation field can often lack inclusivity and diversity. Many projects are addressed through a white lens. So how do we as individuals and professionals make the field more accessible?
Well, it goes back to, once again, talking to the community. A lot of times I've talked to people who have told me things like, hey, I'm trying to get the Black community at near my site, interested in my site, and we're kind of having a hard time doing that. What can we do? And usually my first question is always, well, have you actually talked to the community? And I'm always surprised at how many give me an answer of, oh, wait a minute, yeah, that's probably a good idea. And but going and talking to the community, because the community knows how best to get that information out. The community knows best in terms of what is important to them and how your site relates to them. If the community is telling you, we're not happy with your site and what you're presenting here at your site, you should probably listen. And I know of one that was in New Jersey, for instance, and it had always been interpreted from the point of view of the owner when it spent the last 50, 60 years of its existence as a YWCA for African American women. And so the community was kind of hands off about it because it was just being interpreted through the lens of the owners who were white. And when the actual site stepped back and was like, wait, this is why? Oh no. And they changed their reinterpretation. They changed the focus to also definitely include the story of the YWCA, and they found that the community then embraced the site again. And so it's by doing things like that, listening to those community knowledge holders, going out and actually talking to the community and finding out what's important, what's needed, what do I need to be paying attention to, that can be really helpful.
That's so helpful. And actually, it's a great follow-up question. I think this will probably have to be our last one, but can you give us a guide to a few exemplary interpretive installations that help tell a site's story? I think that could possibly be good models or reference points.
Ooh. I'm just thinking, it's interesting because there are so many sites that because it all depends upon what you're thinking of in terms of interpretation. If we're talking about exhibits, are we talking about just experience? It depends. It's the best way I can put it. It depends. I say that the ones who do it best, are the ones who really are looking at the story and thinking about, how can I tell this best? How can I give true, how can I give a true feeling for what this story is really about? How is this authentic? How is this genuine to the story? And to me, those are the ones who do it best. And I think about places such as Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, who is this incredible place of pain, and has made this decision. We are going to tell the story of this place entirely from the viewpoint of the enslaved. And to me, that is actually one of my favorite examples of interpretation done at a plantation site, for instance. And because it's made this very bold choice compared to many others in terms of this is what we will do. And other side, there's so many other sites. They're doing it well. It's hard. It's actually hard for me to choose. I feel like I can give you like that general in terms of how to do it best.
Well, I think, it is, that was very subjective. Well, there's so many different ways to approach it, but I think you've opened up yourself and the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund as a resource. And I think you're probably going to be inundated with questions from Massachusetts. But as we're coming up on time, I think this is a good place to stop. But Lawana Holland-Moore, thank you so very much for your very inspiring and informative presentation. I think you have just given us so much to think about, and there are a lot of difficult and uncomfortable conversations ahead, but that just means that we're making progress and making change. But thank you so very, very much for giving of your time and your expertise. Thank you, thank you, thank you to everybody. We hope you enjoyed the keynote presentation. Enjoy the rest of the conference. This will be linked, and the recording will be linked by the end of the day today. So thank you once again on behalf of Preservation Massachusetts and our Preservation Statewide Conference. Thank you, Luana, and everyone. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Goodbye.